This lecture continues looking at the Minoan civilization and their pottery that would spread throughout the Mediterranean and the Near East, and then turn to the Greek mainland with Mycenaean, otherwise known as Helladic art. Now, continuing with the Minoans, who are going to be on the island of Crete, dominating the Mediterranean in the 2nd millennium BCE, we have developed Chimeris ware named for the town of Chimeris near the cave on Mount Ida that overlooks Phaistos. Here we have a type of pottery that would become so popular and be produced in many cities on the island of Crete that it would be exported to Egypt and Syria, highly prized for its thin nature, its delicate decorations and glaze. Now, in the 2nd millennium BCE, we have the potter's wheel invented, which is still a very important invention in the history of material culture. For, as we discussed in the Neolithic period, we do find earlier remnants of cups and bowls, but usually they're made in very small batches and they cannot be replicated. So generally they're used for holding objects for ceremonies and or ritualistic libations. With the invention of the kick wheel, we could form uniform standards for pottery and ensure that we have a consistent width and shape of a vessel that we can build up into greater and more complex shapes. So this allows us to then create objects not only for holding materials and shipping them, such as wine and olive oil, but to be appreciated aesthetically in and of themselves. Here we have a Chimeris ware jug, giving you an example of this extremely thin, colorful, and graceful stylized decoration on this type of pottery. Here we find that the neck of the pot is going to gracefully give way to the handle, which continues the decorations of these spiral forms around the exterior of the jug. Now, the curving forms are going to be dominant on Minoan pottery, for just like their art, where they appreciate vivacity and liveliness and organic action, here we'll often find either stylized plant life or sea life form, pelagic forms, such as the octopus flask here from Policastro. Now, on Policastro, we're going to find the Policastro youth, that young god that we looked at last time. And here we see the continued interest, like that young god, in anatomy, liveliness, and action. The octopus, like the Chimeris ware jug, is going to be painted on a very thin vessel, but covering all of the exterior space, ensuring that they do not leave negative space. So where the octopus's tentacles are not located, the painter has filled it in with various plant life and or sea life elements. This love of organic fluidity comes from their trade, right, as seafarers. That being the maritime empire built by Crete is going to ensure that they appreciate the undulating rhythms of the waves and the organic nature and appreciation of it, of the hills and mountains, of the surrounding islands around Crete. Now, the harvester vase is going to come from Hagia Triada on Crete and is going to be created in around 1500 BCE. Now, we find that only the upper portion of the vase and the neck survives. The lower section is going to be a recreation. It is, in fact, a rhyton, which is going to be a ritualistic vessel used for drinking ritualistic libations. Usually alcoholic or hallucinatory substances are going to be taken by way of these vessels during religious practices, much as in the Eucharist today, Catholics drink wine. This is just going to have been much more strongly potent and used more broadly in the ancient Mediterranean than in today's modern Christian world. The dominant forms of these rhytons, as you can see here, very often take on the appearance of bulls and or other powerful objects associated with kingship. So in this one, for instance, you would fill up the vessel and drink from the bull's mouth, taking into yourself the power, the sustenance, and the masculinity and virility of this bull. On the harvester vase, we do not see bulls, but instead a group of 27 men who are marching and chanting, moving left to right. Here is an image of them laid out entirely, where we can see them in various positions, overlapping sometimes 4 men deep, all carrying these threshing rods, being led by one man in a cloak at the front. So here you have another detail showing them singing in riotous action and motion and are ready to go about the planting or harvesting. So the figure at the front is obviously leading them. He has long hair and a ceremonial cloak, along with a commanding staff. We are giving thanks to the spring planting or the fall harvest in a religious procession, often accompanied by a dance. That is the most likely scenario that we have here, giving thanks to the gods and goddesses for allowing us to grow from the land, to get sustenance from their gifts to us. The subject, that is, the subject of harvesting, was common in ancient Egyptian art, and we have seen it before, such as with the painting of the goats treading seed and the cattle fording a canal. However, unlike the ancient Egyptians, we do not have a repeated series of figures that are identical and do not overlap. Instead, we have an individualized, riotous crowd with an interest shown in facial expression, muscular skeletal structure, and the action and activities made possible by the nude human form. This is very different and will show us the new direction in art that we'll look at next. Now, following the Minoans, the next civilization to rise on the Greek mainland is the Mycenaean, otherwise known as the Helladic civilization from 3000 to 1000 BCE. Now, the name Helladic comes from the Greek name for Greece itself, and that is Hellas. Hence, Helladic is going to represent the Aegean Bronze Age on the mainland of the Peloponnesus and of Western Europe. Now, we know that the native peoples living here in a Neolithic culture were displaced by Greek-speaking peoples who arrived around 3000 BCE, making their way south. They brought with them metalworking, ceramics, architectural designs, all of the things necessary for civilization, and that made it fairly easy for them to brush aside a culture that was still using stone weapons and tools. Now, Mycenae, which is going to be on the Peloponnesus here in the south, is going to rise to power to influence all of the islands in this coming period. Now, Mycenaean civilization is going to be supposedly where Agamemnon's citadel is going to be held and located, and so we find that this is dedicated and is found historically during the Trojan War around 1200 BCE. Of course, Troy being right across the Aegean Sea and the main ancient rivals to the Bronze Age Greeks. Now, the palace and citadel of Tiryns at Mycenae, which is built around 1400 to 1200 BCE, expanded each time that the power of the Mycenaeans expands, shows us that this civilization is not ruled by an oligarchy or democracy, but instead by a monarchy. Now, different from the Minoans, this citadel is a walled fortress or palace that is going to sit high on a hilltop, making it even more difficult to conquer and or breach the city walls. Each time the civilization grew, these walls expanded further and further outward, being rebuilt 3 different times, each time larger and stronger than the last, from 340, 1250, and finally in 1200 BCE. Now, the last one, of course, was intended to protect the water supply, because that would be the easiest way to lay siege to a citadel if you could poison the wells. Now, the main entrance leading to the inner keeps is going to force you through this narrow passageways with crenulated towers to either side, making it easily defensible by archers. Now, the walls would have been imposing. This corbelled gallery in the walls of the citadel showing you what the defenders of the city would have seen as they moved between the walls to the windows to surveil the land surrounding them and or to fire projectiles at enemies below. Now, Pausanias, who's going to write a guidebook to Greece and places to visit in the 2nd century Common Era, is going to state that these walls were as spectacular as the pyramids themselves. And they are going to be massive. This very much impressed the ancients. They're 25 feet thick and 30 feet high, which is standard for defensive walls since the Neolithic period. This makes them ideal for defense. The large megalithic blocks are going to be cantilevered inwards and are not dressed, and they do not have mortar. Therefore, they look fairly primitive and unfinished, which led the ancient Greeks, given their size and unfinished nature, to the conclusion that men could not move these. They must have been built by Cyclops. Hence, these are called Cyclopean masonry examples. So only the one-eyed creatures from mythology, such as Polyphemus, who eats Odysseus's men, would be able to lift such huge, massive megalithic stones. Here is another view of the exterior showing you the sheer power and brute force that is suggested when approaching these walls, which must have intimidated Bronze Age Greek individuals who came to visit this citadel. Now, the architecture used to create it is not new, that being, it is a corbelled arch in which you have the stones inset and leaning on one another. Thus, of course, they press against one another to hold up these interior spaces. Very much like an unfinished version of the Grand Gallery of Khufu's Great Pyramid at Giza. Only this time we see the stones are unfinished here. Leading up to the entrance of the citadel, we have the Lion Gate, which is going to, at the same time, introduce you to the city and protect the city simultaneously as an apotropaic device. Now, the corbelled arch is going to be relieved by way of the weight above this massive stone lintel by way of a relieving triangle. And the relieving triangle has a carving of it of two feline or lion-like creatures flanking a column. Now, this relieves the weight and, of course, makes it possible to have a larger open area to the gate. Now, the Lion Gate, as it's called, does not show animals with teats or penises, so we do not know if they are a particular gender. We also do not have their heads, so if they were eagle heads, they could have been griffins, but they need wings. If they were human heads, then they could be influenced by the ancient Egyptians because they would relate to sphinxes. What we do know is that they are Near Eastern in origin and shows us that the civilization had contact with the area now known as Turkey and the ancient Sumerians and Mesopotamians before them, because we have a heraldic device here. We have a composite creature of animals or sphinxes, but also flanking a central image, which is close to the heraldic devices unique to Mesopotamia, where you would have a central figure flanked by the same two figures on either side. Making it past the Lion's Gate, you would be able to eventually make your way to the Megaron, or the reception hall of the king, the central meeting place and the heart of power for the Mycenaeans. Here we would have had the design for later Greek temples established for the rulers of this Bronze Age in ancient Greece. In the plan, we note that a megaron is a 4 series of columns surrounding a central hearth with a fire that, through light and air opening in the ceiling, would ventilate the interior and provide illumination inside of it. The single room in the circular hearth in the throne room provided the model for the megaron and for later temples in the ancient Greek pantheon. Here is a reconstruction of the Megaron, showing that we would have had relief sculptures on the walls that are polychromed and painted to reflect the chimerical creatures like we saw in the Lion Gate a moment ago. Now, this is going to be associating royalty with the gods, a popular anthropological notion that the Greek gods will develop from earlier rulers and systems of government. Thus, they are modeled on previous institutions. Now, we know that Agamemnon and other rulers in Mycenae, had they existed, would have been buried in structures like what we see here. The so-called treasury at Atreus, discovered by Schliemann, he is going to believe this is actually where Agamemnon was buried. However, this was not the treasury where he would bring back the gold and jewels and the war booty from the War of Troy. Instead, this is a type of tomb known as a Tholos tomb, in which all wealthy Mycenaeans were buried outside of the citadel. These are circular beehive-shaped tombs, hence they get their name from the circular shape. Now, leading up to this beehive-shaped tomb, we have a tholos, a circular tomb, yet the entryway is known as a dromos, as seen here. The dromos, much like earlier Karen tombs in the UK, would prepare the visitor for visiting the deceased, entering into the realm of the underworld. For the deceased corpses of their ancestors were not buried here, but instead laid out on the floor in a ceremonial fashion. Now, in Neolithic passage graves, we would have had also a long entryway with these entoptic images that allowed us to contemplate death as we approached before seeing and entering the tomb itself proper. Once entering the actual tomb, here we have the vault of the Tholos seen upward and the relieving triangle above the door, which is very impressive for the ancient Greeks who follow these Bronze Age predecessors. At 43 feet high, we have a massive interior space that is the oldest surviving corbelled vaulted dome in antiquity and the largest enclosed interior space without supports until the Pantheon is created around 125 Common Era. However, the Pantheon's dome is made of solid concrete, and the Romans are working with much more sophisticated technologies than the Mycenaeans. Inside of these Tholos tombs, as in the treasury of Atreus, as it's understood here, we would have had the wealthy laid out on the floor, men and women. And here we have the so-called Mask of Agamemnon, certainly a funerary mask that would have gone over the head or face of the deceased on the ground. Now, tombs are reserved for kings and their families, the most wealthy members of this monarchy. The dead are laid out on the floors of these tombs, not buried, their faces covered with masks to avoid seeing the decomposition and effects on the bodies. Men are going to be adorned with what they were associated with in life, weapons, while women are also going to be buried with what they are most known for, jewelry. So in this civilization, men are expected to be warriors, while women are held up as models of beauty, chastity, and virtue. To make the funerary mask, we have a new technique here known as repoussé, in which we have the metal flattened area here that's hammered from the back and pushed forward to create this relief of a face. Now, the types here are not unique to one individual, such as the King Agamemnon, but instead relate to types such as the youthful or mature type. In the case of the death mask of Tutankhamun, we have the youthful type, Whereas the bearded face of Agamemnon, carrying forward in the ancient Greek culture, relates to maturity, in which a man can only grow a beard from 30 years of age onwards. Along with this beard, buried here in the treasury of Atreus, we also have weapons that associate this ruler with the fact that he is a warrior and soldier. This inlaid dagger with a blade decorated with a lion hunt from Grave Circle A is going to illustrate that. In it, we find that a group of men, 4 in all, are going to be fighting this lion, with the 5th man having fallen under the lion's paws. He is in a flying gallop, while 2 other lions are going to flee at the tip of the dagger. This flying gallop would have been known to the Bronze Age Mycenaeans with their contact they had with the Cretans or Minoans. And we know that this decorative scheme and subject is the same that is mentioned on the shield and armor that we have here of Agamemnon and Achilles respectively, thus connecting it with the Iliad and confirming Schliemann's association with this site and the Iliad. The flying gallop again is going to have been connected to the Mycenaean civilization, showing that the Mycenaeans are going to pick up this stylistic interest in motion, in movement, in organic fluidity. Now, turning to the final stage of the Mycenaean civilization around 1200 BCE, we already see in the warrior's vase the transition to the style that would come to dominate the Dark Ages and that would then be picked up in the geometric period of ancient Greece. In it, we have women at the left who are seeing off men to battle, these soldiers, one after another, identically clad, and are going to have the same features. There is no setting behind the soldiers. It is schematic and abstract, foretelling this retreat from naturalism. This retreat from what we saw before in the harvester vase, where we also find a series of men moving left to right, as we find that writing will develop in the Western world as well. We naturally read things left to right. But now, instead of having a group of individuals who are going to be in succession acting individually, shouting at different times, moving and being placed in different areas, we have the same person, the same nose and eyes, and the same chest and legs, and the same spear and shield shown over and over again. The abandonment of lively organic action thus foretells what will happen next in the civilization. Now, this is going to also remind us of Egyptian art, in which we have the exact same figures and features repeated over and over, not showing us what something would have looked like, but instead communicating in a conceptual fashion the idea of an army going off to battle, instead of a group of individual soldiers. The reversion to stylized motifs reminds us of Cyclopean art, and will foretell the fall into the Dark Ages that is going to follow this Mycenaean age, or the Bronze Age in ancient Greece, in which we will see widespread illiteracy, a lack of centralized government, and we have no records historically of what happened in this era. When we return, we will begin with the geometric period, in which we see the same interest in schematization, in stylization of the human form. Next class, we are going to have our midterm, so please review your notes and prepare.